Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we have a wonderful discussion ahead of us. First of all, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. By doing all those things, you show the algorithm who's boss. But today we're going to be talking about the coronation. We're going to be going through the liturgy specifically of the coronation and talking about the history behind it and the cultural implications for mostly England and the UK, and so Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland as well as even the Commonwealth. We don't want to forget that England has a great, or Britain has a great effect on all those nations, including anybody in the Anglosphere, which includes the United States. So we have an awesome panel with us today. Uh, I'm going to bring us all together. First, to my right, we have Charles Coulombe, the great monarchist historian, the author of the Blessed Charles book, as well as many books regarding monarchy and history. Welcome back to the show, Charles.
Thank you very much. Great to be back, Connor.
And then at the bottom, I have Theo Howard of Vonday Radio, and as well as an author and contributing editor at 1 Peter 5. He has also been, his work has been placed in Crisis Magazine as well. Thank you for coming on the show, Theo.
Thank you for having me, Connor. It's great to be back on Plotlines.
Well, thank you both for coming. It's an honor to have the two of you. I know you've both collaborated in the past, so it's fun to have you both on Plotlines. So that's kind of fun. So I have two things we're going to be looking at as we go through our discussion. I have a bit of a slideshow with some images from the coronation of Charles III, as well as we're also going to go through the liturgy itself. Now, we may have a few guests pop in later in the episode, so don't be too shocked if somebody pops up. uh, anyways, Charles, will you start us off with sort of a historical perspective on the coronation? What's the historical importance?
Well, the first thing to remember about the coronation is that it's sort of a desiccated remnant of what was once the foremost state ceremonial in every Catholic nation in Europe. And that was the coronation of a new king. Until 1960, there was an ordo for the coronation of a new king in the Pontificale, the Roman Pontificale. At various times after the Middle Ages, one by one, the different nations of Europe dropped it. The Catholic nations, generally because of revolution, the Protestant nations in Scandinavia, particularly simply because they didn't want to emphasize things royal if they could get away with it. The last Catholic king to be crowned was Blessed Emperor Karl in 1916 in Budapest. And the last Catholic coronation was Pope Paul VI in 1963. Now, with the exception of the papal coronation, the crowning itself was not actually the major action of the coronation. That came beforehand, and that was the anointing with oil in emulation of the anointing of King David by the prophet Samuel. And this was an important thing for Catholic monarchs because they saw their kingship as a participation in the kingship of Christ. And of course, Christ was the legitimate heir of David and united his kingship with the communio of the church at the Last Supper. So these things are all very much in the minds of our medieval ancestors in terms of the church investing kings with authority and legitimacy. One interesting point that I'm sure we'll come to during the course of the evening. Most Catholic kings and the Holy Roman Emperor, when they were crowned, were anointed with the oil of catechumens. But 5 had the special privilege of being anointed with chrism, the way bishops are. And they were the kings of France, Scotland, Sicily, Jerusalem, and England. And the reason for this is that in the Catholic framework, the monarch was seen as sort of a mixed person by virtue of the coronation. He was partly clerical, partly lay. And one of the interesting elements of that is that when the Holy Roman Emperor would be in Rome at the papal mass, he played deacon. And when the King of France was there, he would play subdeacon. The king, when he was crowned, the Holy Roman Emperor would be made a canon of St. Peter's, the King of France of St. John Lateran, the King of Spain, St. Mary Major, and the King of England, before the Protestant revolt, St. Paul outside the walls. So in looking at the coronation today, we are looking at the last remnant for most of it, except the oath, which I'm sure we'll be talking about. Except for the oath, we are looking at the last remnant of what was one of the foremost Catholic rites in Christendom. And it's been Protestantized, Anglicized, etc. But in its broad outlines, you can still see what our ancestors believed and what the church taught them about the nature of monarchy in the state.
Thank you, Charles. Theo, would you like to give us sort of how an idea of how the coronation affects the public of England and Scotland and the UK in general? What kind of how big of a deal is it? I guess I should say.
Well, just to touch on the history there that Charles has outlined so lucidly. For those of us that are concerned with the lay apostolate and with the consecration of the civil authority, as Charles says, this ceremony, this rite, represents one of the last shadows or outlines of that consecrated civil power that we still have today. In the image that you had on screen just there, I'm sure we'll get into this, but seeing as Charles mentioned the mixed nature of the monarch, you saw King Charles there wearing the gold super tunica, which is modeled on the deacon's dalmatic. And that's because the King of England would be ordained a subdeacon at his coronation in order to be able to serve Mass. And I believe, and I think Charles might be able to correct me or alter any details that I get wrong here, but at least the Holy Roman Emperor would have the deacon's stole underneath the super tunica, and then on the royal regalia on top, which represented that he was a cleric, but this was secondary to his lay identity. And so they are a mixed person, but they are first and foremost the head of the authority, the temporal sphere, at least in that nation. And so that was all symbolized in the coronation garb. Now, this ancient rite can be traced all the way back to the first coronation of a true king of the English, Rex Angelorum, King Edgar, by the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 10th century, St. Dunstan, who was responsible for bringing at the beginnings of the Gregorian reforms into the Anglo-Saxon England. And King Edgar, I believe, was the great grandson of King Alfred the Great. And that coronation took place in the city of Bath. And Bath is a lovely town. Today, it's largely Georgian in character, but the coronation took place at the abbey there, which is between, which is very close to the original Roman baths, hence the name. So the ceremony that took place was between two worlds: the ancient Roman world, where monarchs were, at least they maintained a democratic quality, or they had the pretense of that under the Principate, and then the baptized Christian world, of whom King Edgar was one of the first authoritative Christian rulers of the whole of the English peoples, because the Saxon folk had been divided into 7 kingdoms that had slowly united. So when we look at the liturgy, a lot of that comes originally from that first coronation of St. Dunstan. And then you can see in this image here the beautiful marble pavement called the Cosmati pavement, on which the coronation took place, is usually covered in carpet, such as its preciousness and its delicacy. But that was inlaid in the 13th century by Italian craftsmen, and it is made up of sliced parts of Roman columns, beautiful porphyry and marble, precious, semi-precious stones, which again links to this the source of one of the sources of the Occident, namely Imperial Rome. So all of that is resonant in this rite that we witnessed. As for the English public, they might not be totally cognizant of all of that, but for them, there is still an inchoate sense that this is a national occasion of tremendous importance, and they took the opportunity to celebrate, and you can see in the amount of coverage and interaction that people had with the coronation that it has that public interest. David Starkey's talked about how the modern monarchy, the Windsor monarchy, is in the paradigm of what he calls family monarchy, and this attracts the interest particularly of women. What are the people wearing, and how cute is Prince Louis, and all those sort of elements for the modern, at least in the early 20th century, the sort of bourgeois society. So there's layers of engagement, and we can get into that.
Thank you, Theo. Dr. Joseph Shaw has joined us. Thank you, Dr. Shaw, for joining us. Dr. Joseph Shaw is a doctor in philosophy from Oxford University. Are you here? Do you hear me, Dr. Shaw? Sorry.
Yes, I certainly do, and I apologize. I thought it was GMT, not BST.
I'm sorry. The time.
Somebody's in Austria and was catered to. It's one of those things.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. Maybe that's Mr. Bogle might be on the same problem. Anyways, thank you for joining us. We're recording, just so you know. I hope that's all right. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Shaw, would you like to add anything to the history of the English or the British coronation?
Well, not having heard the whole of Theo's.
Sorry.
Yes,
Yeah.
I hesitate to add anything to that. I mean, it's a fascinating subject. I think that I don't know as much about it by any means as I would like. And indeed, I thought it was interesting what Theo said about on the one hand, people don't know all the details, but nevertheless they derive something from it. And of course, the same is true of the liturgy. you can appreciate the traditional liturgy of the Catholic Church without understanding all the details. I think it's an important point to make. The details are wonderful, and it's great to learn about them and everything, but they at another level, all these details and the complexity and the history of it, they build up into this mysterious whole, which can be appreciated by people who haven't read all that stuff in the kind of detailed way. They get the impression, the correct impression, of something which is ancient, complex, and indescribably solemn. And that impression is the essential message of it, the solemnity, the dignity of the whole thing.
As the head of the Latin Mass Society of England and Wales, I imagine you have most interest in the liturgical side of things. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not sure I would say that, actually, because I haven't studied the liturgy of the coronation much as I would like to, and it's interesting to me, but I haven't made a study of it like I think Theo has. But I'm as someone who is interested in the idea of liturgy and the idea of the mystery and everything, that it's the whole thing is very interesting. But I'm also interested in obviously the political realities of the monarchy, simply as a citizen of this country.
How does the political situation? Do you think it has any? Do you think it's changed by experiencing another coronation since the last one was so long ago? Was it 70 years ish ago?
70 years,
yeah. Well, if we think that the liturgy of the coronation has any effect at all, then it's going to be a positive reinforcement of the values of the monarchy, the meaning of the monarchy. That's something, of course, we do get with the state opening of Parliament, when that happens more frequently, with royal funerals, to a lesser extent with the royal weddings, and other events, royal baptisms. We're kind of reminded by all these natural events of the existence of the royal family and the fact that they do things. And of course, unlike some of the constitutional monarchies in Europe, they really go for it. They kind of do things properly, even if it's a bit less complex and solemn than it has been in other centuries. It's still extremely impressive from the point of view of a modern person who doesn't have a great deal of ritual in his life. It's staggering. So it'd be interesting to see whether this affects attitudes. It's important to bear in mind that, like any constitutional arrangement, the popularity of the monarchy, to the degree to which people think that it's clearly a good thing, ebbs and flows over time. And that's just a fact of political life. So if you ask people about how happy they are with the American Constitution, you'll find it ebbs and flows a bit, over the decades. That same is true with the monarchy. And we've been through a bit of a rough patch. We went through one rough patch with the problem of the breakup of the marriage of the Prince and Princess of Wales, as they were then, and the business with Meghan Markle hasn't been great, although it hasn't damaged the monarchy in the way that one might think, looking at American opinion on those shenanigans. Nevertheless, it's been negative, but I think this will be very positive. This is really reinforced the kind of the awe-inspiring nature of the whole thing.
Great. Yeah, Charles, do you have something to say?
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. One is, Theo, you'll be happy to know that the king did wear a stole. Alongside the super tunica, so that has been maintained. But the thing is that speaking to the Princess Meghan and Prince Harry debacle, I think in America anyway, and I can't think that I can't think that the United States are more pro-monarchy than Britain. I think the attempts by Meghan and her husband to blacken the royal family have, if anything, backfired, judging by American opinion, because they come across as biting the hand that fed them, you know. And in all of this, the king behaved with a great deal of dignity beforehand. The coronation was very, very touching in a lot of ways, and the things that led up to it. I was very impressed watching the accession proclamations, not just in Britain, but around the Commonwealth. How every, if you'll pardon the expression, two-bit politician that could got in on the action, as we say. Happily reading forth all the sonorous tones of the medieval-esque proclamation of our dread Lord King Charles III, here in Wagga Wagga, New South Wales. Even though you knew when you were watching that half those politicians were atheist and half Republican, nevertheless, they were very happy for one shining moment to invoke the blessings of Almighty God upon their dread sovereign. They got caught up in the moment.
Yeah. Theo, do you think that will be a spiritual boost? Because we've discussed the decline in Christianity on a previous podcast. Do you think that there will be maybe a little more of an awakening regarding Christianity in the UK by looking at this, or is the public too far gone in some sense especially Anglicanism?
I think it's salutary for the public to be reminded that the country is a constitutionally Anglican state, and to have such an important occasion very much permeated with Christian prayer, or albeit Anglican Protestant prayer. I think it, to be quite honest, for most people will come across increasingly arcane and incongruous. If we again reflect back on the previous coronation, 1953, we're talking about a time when the general public still understood the basic lineaments of the gospel narratives, for example. They understood the general outline of at least the parts of the Christian of divine revelation that the Catholic Church and the Anglican conventicle share in common. But these days, we're way beyond that. One notices this visiting something like the National Gallery, particularly the medieval parts of that institution, and you see many bemused looking millennials and Gen Xers and Generation Zs, and they're looking at pietas and crucifixion paintings and paintings of Our Lady and of the Martyrdom of the Saints, and they just look completely lost. And I always think, well, is it sort of striking them that all of this material culture is all about one story and all about one man, the God man? What is it? Is the thought going through their head that this was clearly something that was right at the heart of English culture, even as recently as 100 years ago? So I think so much of that will be lost on the public. So I wouldn't anticipate any kind of spiritual recovery in that sense. I think it's edifying for the public. I think that any sort of dignified ceremony like this is such, as we were saying before, is such an outlier with regard to modern statecraft and modern politics that it can't help but move people. I mean, the anthem of Zadok the priest during the coronation, I mean, it sends deep chills through most observers. So all of that, I think, will have its effect, hopefully, as a kind of pre-evangelization, one can hope, But I think seeing the sorry example of the Anglican hierarchy there and the bishopesses and so on would not necessarily reinforce that. And I'm sorry to say, but I think Welby's sermon, I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts on this. Welby's sermon was actually not bad. I think it was concise, and it pointed to Christ as the King of Kings. I thought that it very much pointed to those elements of the liturgy. I was struck by how often the phrase he came not to be served but to serve, which is the leitmotif of Christian monarchy, was invoked. So one can hope with all of that, but I do think, I think his voice, his kind of reedy voice, was not the most impressive, but overall, pretty good.
I heard it somewhere, I can't remember where, but someone said that the English look awkward performing this liturgy. Do any of you have any thoughts on that? Is there do you guys think they did it well, like performed it well?
As well as you can with a flock of bishopesses and that kind of thing. The thing, I just want to make one quick note to Theo's response to the question of spiritual awakening or whatever. I was very much amused by the complaint in one of the liberal papers in England that having the populace recite an oath of allegiance was, and I quote, putting God into the mouths of the people. And I thought, oh, that's so terrible. Gee willikers, I don't know what to say. Just terrible.
Dr. Shaw, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I'm interested in what Theo said about the sun, which I confess I didn't listen to, but what Theo said is very conformable to the way that the prayers have been adapted this time around, tweaked consistently to emphasize this notion of service rather than the themes of upholding justice, defending the realm, and that's something worth noting. I think it's understandable they should be sort of moving things in that direction to make it easier to understand and seem less threatening. But of course, there's a danger that one ends up with a one-sided conception of the office of monarchy, and actually a kind of a monarch that goes on and on about serving and defending and something actually doesn't bear the sword is not going to be much use. And as far as the monarch stands for the state, that's a slightly troubling message, which in fact it is something which I think says something not just about the monarchy, but with the British state and the kind of the modern states of around the developed world, that there's a great deal about serving and health and safety and making people feel happy about themselves, and not a great deal about protecting us from criminals or foreign invasion or things like that. And that's
protecting us from criminals might be seen as an attack on the political class.
Yeah, I can see that might be problematic. No, they couldn't turn on their own, could they? Well, but it's in that way, of course, it's a bit of a bellwether of the kind of the thinking of the political elite. And I think that one of the values of this ancient ceremony is that it is not simply the thinking of the political elite. Although they've tweaked it, the underlying message, the underlying structure and the symbols, above all these amazing symbols that he was handed, they retain their value and their meaning, something which we can appeal to, which is real, which is part of the function of the state, And it's not just about service. It's about the sword which he does not wield in vain, and all that and so on.
Yes, thank you. It's also it seems like King Charles tried to maintain as much of traditional uniforms and stuff like that, and sort of, and is the right word costume? I don't like the word costume for it, but is there a better word? What's the Charles? Is there a better word?
Vestments.
Vestments, I guess that.
I think
Yeah,
they're
vestments.
Okay. Sorry, vestments. Even for like everyone else, would that still work for everyone else? Vestments, not just for him, but for the like Prince and Princess of Wales. Like, what would you consider what they're wearing?
Uniforms.
Okay, so
the Prince of Wales was wearing the robes of the Order of the Garter.
Yeah.
Okay.
But if he'd not been a member of the Order of the Garter, he would have been wearing a military uniform, I suppose. But yeah.
Well, my understanding is he tell them to wear their uniforms, if not. So it sounds like he tried to make things uphold more tradition in places he could. Is that, Charles? Do you think that's a good understanding? Is that true?
I do. I mean, he himself is a mixture of things, in the sense of being a senior member of my generation, the boomers, and he has a love of tradition. But you are a member of the time you're a member of, and so there are certain things in the new rite of coronation and the adjusted rite that are obviously his handiwork. One of them, of course, was his prayer, which is the annotation in the Ordo says is probably one of the most personal things we've ever gotten from a British monarch. And it's a nice enough prayer in its way, rather touching. I think that a number of, like one of the things that we touched on before you came, Doctor, was the peers not wearing coronation robes and so forth. How much he had to do with that, I don't know. But I think that to the strictly liturgical things, I think he had a lot of say. Especially there are a number of the prayers, especially dealing with the swords and so on, that have been completely untouched or almost. And I think that was probably his doing.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I brought up the liturgy. This is the authorized liturgy for the coronation, and I'd like to go through it with you gentlemen, and please feel free to interject and your thoughts regarding the parts if you have something. Otherwise, if you don't, I'll just move on to the next part. Does that sound good?
Oh,
Okay.
sure.
Certainly.
So we have the procession of this is controversial procession of faith leaders and representatives of faith communities. This was probably one of the most do you think, or one of the most, I don't know, degenerate, I guess, aspects of the coronation. Did Charles have a hand in this? Is this his hand, or is this the government's hand?
At a guess, I would say this was probably him.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why. He's often accused of being a syncretist, but I don't believe that's true. I believe rather members of my generation were brought up to believe, and I think he really sees it this way, that the big struggle of our time is between those of faith and those without it. If you're old enough to remember the Cold War, you could remember the endless propaganda about people of all faiths digging in against godless communism. And it certainly formed a big part of my mental backdrop, and I've no doubt it formed a good deal of his. There's also the fact that despite having religious views of his own, the vast majority of his subjects in Britain and around the Commonwealth do not. And he has to, on some level, take a strike at being their king too. And that, when you consider that there are fewer church-going Anglicans in England than there are church-going Catholics, if he were to crusade as being the great Anglican, there isn't much of a clientele for that. And he could not very well try to be king of all his peoples in quite that fashion. It's not the way I would do it, though. Fortunately, I don't have to.
Yes, you do not. Charles Coulombe is not king of England or
Thank God.
Scotland.
Thank God for the English, and thank God for him.
I don't see any difficulty actually about involving these faith leaders. I mean, they weren't attempting any kind of sacramental role. They're present, and it seems to me, well, good. You know, they were there to endorse by their presence what was happening. It's a kind of homage by them, and I think one of the kind of the big themes of the changes between now the coronation and the previous one is the role of the peers. And I think that's obviously very, very sad in some ways, but I do understand what they're trying to do, which is the peers represented the community. And you know, the hereditary peers of the UK aren't quite such a vivid symbol of the political community as they were, you know, let's say 500 years ago. So instead, they try to bring in other people to represent the community. And one of them, you know, one aspect of this is the slightly unfortunate involvement of people like kind of, you know, not B-list celebrities like Ant and Dec. I think that we could have done without them. But I think that the faith leaders, I think that makes perfect sense. Of course, they should be there. They should make clear that they're part of this.
I guess my thought only on that is that should they be processing, though? If they're there, should they be a formal part of this ceremony well, I know it's an Anglican church, but it used to be a Catholic church at one point.
Connor, believe me when I tell you they could care less about that. But what I was a little bit reminded of was the 1911 Coronation Durbar in New Delhi, which was I think the only time that the King and Queen of Great Britain went to India to be formally invested as Emperor and Empress of India. And that took a whole lot of ceremonial tooling because they had to receive the homage of all sorts of non-Christians, let alone non-Catholics. And there was a touch of the 1911 Durbar in the way they put these things together.
Gotcha. So maybe my knee-jerk reaction is not the best. Theo, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, I would regard this development as perhaps more regrettable than Dr. Shaw and Charles, but not so much here. What I think is more objectionable was firstly the Hindu Prime Minister reading the epistle from the Epistle of Colossians for what it says about religious indifferentism and the lack of integrity behind speaking the words of God. But the actual participation in the liturgy for these interreligious leaders, which was the blessing, the so-called blessing of the king by these figures at the end of the coronation. Now, I will say this. I'd feared that would actually be a lot worse. I thought that they would be in the choir, very much involved in the actual core of the ritual. But in fact, they weren't. They just waited by the door. And as he processed out, he just kind of stopped there for a little bit, and then he just carried on. So it's actually, and this is an overall point I'd like to make, that the objectionable cultural Marxist so-called woke elements were actually fairly minimal, which was quite surprising. And quite uplifting. There wasn't a rainbow flag that I saw. Okay, they had soldieresses very present in front of the cameras in the marching and so on, but it could have been so much worse. So I think we can speculate about how much was the king's decision, but I understand that the traditional council of the coronation, made up of nobility, was replaced this time by Whitehall civil servants, and so those objectionable elements were largely their insistence, including the absence, the most of the absence of the peers of the realm. So that's a further topic we can get onto, because I think that has quite important constitutional connotations. The absence of the peers.
Is there a particular part of the liturgy that you think would be best to talk about that, or?
Well, if you want to get onto it, it's the giving of homage.
Okay. Well, no, we'll get to that.
We'll come to that in due course.
Yes.
What we've got here, of course, is when the king was greeted by the young person from the Chapel Royal. The king's response was, "In his name and after his example, I come not to be served, but to serve." And that, of course, is his first, shall we say, Christian proclamation.
Yes. And it would be great, Charles, if you could let us know if something's been changed drastically from previous coronations.
I suspect that is new. I may be wrong.
Okay.
But I think that is new.
Oh yeah, it says this new inclusion marks the tone of the.
Yeah, it is new. There you go. Yeah.
Okay. Never mind. It tells me here apparently.
It is new.
Okay.
And then the moment of silent prayer, I objected very much to his not telling me what he was saying, but I got over
it. Okay. Yeah. Does anybody it doesn't seem like there's he's not telling anybody either.
No. Well, okay. Well, I don't care about them. I'm the one who didn't get informed.
Okay. It's interesting that that there might be silent remarks, because it's silent or things said silently is a no-go in a lot of liturgies these days.
That's for sure. You don't get moments of silence very often.
Dr. Shaw, do you have anything that stands out regarding that? You're muted. Sorry.
Let's move on.
Okay, sorry. Okay, the greeting and the introduction. It reminded me eerily of maybe not eerily, but it reminded me very much of a Novus Ordo introduction.
Well, but the Kyrie I thought was kind of interesting, given that it was in Welsh, and that's certainly a first.
Yes, that is interesting. To me, it seems because he as Prince of Wales, he learned Welsh and spent some time there, or has spent some time there. Do you think that's the reason for the inclusion?
Absolutely. I mean, similarly, the relics of the True Cross that Pope Francis gave him, he had the British crown jewels, if I remember correctly, did not have a processional cross with bits of the True Cross in them, like so many other sets of crown jewels around Europe do. And now they do, because he had the bits of the True Cross that Pope Francis gave him put into what he calls the Cross of Wales. So now,
and this is a processional cross. This isn't on top of. So this is the thing that walks in front of.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so when the procession started at the coronation, it was led with relics of the True Cross.
I'm not sure that many people who, especially Americans, didn't realize how liturgical this ceremony was.
And why would we? Now, one of the other major differences here was the recognition. We had the various ladies from different chivalric orders. Have to get the chicks involved somehow.
Yes, I thought that was incredibly awkward. And why wouldn't I don't know, is this the same regarding members of the knightly orders participating, or is that
not like this? Not like this. And when they did, they were knights. They weren't dames.
Yeah, okay. But I thought there are dames in England.
There are, but they didn't participate in this manner at the coronation.
Okay, but there are female knights. I always thought that was just
dames.
No, I know.
Dames would just be wives of knights.
Yeah,
but there are dames of the Garter now in their own right.
Okay.
Yeah, the wife of the knight is a lady, not a dame. A dame is a way of creating a female equivalent of a knight. So instead of being Sir John, you was Dame Shirley or whatever. I'm not sure when that originated.
And not to be confused with the American slang of "get a load of them dames."
Yeah, it's an interesting change and addition. And then the presentation of the Bible by the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. I thought this was like, I recognize the importance of this, including the Scots because they're not included in any other manner in the coronation. Am I correct?
You're correct. Scotland has its own set of crown jewels, the honours of Scotland. And up until the time of Charles II, the King of Scots was crowned with them. But Calvinist theology doesn't really admit of coronations the way Anglican theology does. So what will happen is in a week or 2 or 3, I'm not quite sure when, the king will go up to Edinburgh and at St. Giles Cathedral will sort of touch the honours of Scotland while they sit on a table in the middle of the High Kirk. There's a word for it. I don't remember what it is.
Okay. It's interesting, but they don't have a problem participating in the coronation here. I know
never expect things like that to make sense.
Okay, yeah. The oath. Okay, so this is where things get spicy, right?
Yeah. Well, they do, and it's worth remembering that the coronation oath of today is much less annoying and objectionable to Catholics than the one that was taken from William III to Edward VII. And the reason for that is that the coronation oath of Charles I simply talked about protecting the churches and bishops of God. It because it was medieval, and it made no reference to Catholic, Anglican, or anything else. So Henry took it, Elizabeth took it, Charles I took it, James II took it. And then just to make sure that everybody knew what the story was, when William III came in, his coronation oath had a long, not only to say he was a Protestant reform person like this thing does, but it had a long diatribe against transubstantiation and so on. Well, Edward VII did not want to take it. He did. George V flat out refused to, and so it was sort of boulderized to what we have now.
Did you say Edward did take it?
Edward VII, he finally gave in and took it, but he was not happy about it.
And he died on his deathbed, converted to Catholicism.
So they say. There are a number of sources to that effect.
Okay. So interesting enough. Theo, what is sort of the general reaction from the English population? Because they don't really care very much, right? That someone's promising to be a Protestant Reformed, or do they? Is this important to the average Englishman?
No, not really. Hardly at all. The alteration that's happened here was in the previous part of the oath, an insertion by the Archbishop of Canterbury, where the king promises to uphold the quote unquote true profession of the gospel, and then he added the clause, and in so doing, create an environment that's tolerable for those that practice all religions and none. That's the novelty in this part.
I don't remember the none part. I thought it was
maybe it doesn't say none, but anyway, it has interesting constitutional implications because we are an Anglican integralist state, and as Cardinal Newman reflected, or St. John Henry Newman wrote, the transition to a formerly liberal secular state would be a bad thing. An Anglican integralist state is better than a liberal indifferentist secular state. And that oath seems to suggest a slight draw in that direction.
Dr. Shaw, does this change any of the political situations regarding, with a new oath or with a sort of modified oath that is still saying that that the king will defend the Church of England and ensure the Protestant succession, but also to ensure others peace and prosperity? Like how do you think that what does that mean for the future politically?
Well, I think this oath is a reflection of the attitude right now and by Charles, an evolving attitude, as Charles indicated. It's been tweaked before, and no doubt it'll go on being tweaked. But I agree with Theo very much that we're better off with an officially Anglican state than with a nothing. Although I should point out that this oath talks about the Church of England, and by law established in England. Now, the Anglican Church is not the established Church of Scotland. It's not the established church in Northern Ireland. It's not even the established church in Wales. It's sort of a bit of an open question in English law whether Wales exists.
It's very true, and you may remember during the Accession Council, the Accession Privy Council, he signed an oath to defend the privileges of the Church of Scotland.
That's right. So it's quite a complicated, delicate, and oddly robust situation. That I think it's a bit strong to say that this is an Anglican integralist state. I think you can't really have an Anglican integralist state which the established church isn't established.
Gentlemen, I'm sorry to have to do this, but I have to excuse myself.
No problem, Charles. Thank you for being with us today.
You're most welcome. God bless you all, and God save the King.
Bye, Charles.
Bye, Charles. So the state, it stays in very murky waters. Of course, it says in some sense that it's an integralist state, but as you said, Dr. Shaw, it's only in England specifically that's a part of the, what the church is established only in England. But there aren't very many regularly attending Anglicans. How many Anglicans do they need or not have before they sort of give up on this church?
Well, you know something. I've been thinking about this a bit, but what strikes me that you don't. The question of the religious nature of the ceremony and of the monarchy is not quite the same as a question of the religious constitution of the general population or even the state as such. And well, I don't think it would be a good thing for the Church of England to be disestablished at this juncture in history. Nevertheless, it's not inconceivable for there to be a head of state who's not the same religion as the established church. And we did actually have that for 2 years under James II. Rather more successfully, this was the case in Saxony. The Kingdom of Saxony had a Catholic monarch. It was a Protestant kingdom. And, you know, this can happen, you know, it's happened in one or two other places over the centuries. So it's possible to have a kind of modus vivendi. There are things you have in common with your subjects. There are things you don't have in common. The subjects can respect the king, for the monarch, for having, you know, his own kind of religious establishment. So it's actually, there are kind of all sorts of ways of finessing and tweaking and things. So I think that it's not straight. It's not simply a matter of the Church of England, the establishment, the nature of the state, the nature of the coronation, and the nature of the personal faith of the monarch, all standing and falling together. Actually, that they're all these things are kind of connected with each other in a sort of slightly complicated way. And those are the sorts of complications where actually we're quite comfortable with in England. The kind of the complexity and the historical ambiguity of the whole thing.
Yes, and you know, of course, it's not like if the Church of England went away, it wouldn't become a Catholic integralist country or anything like that, by any stretch of the imagination.
No, that's certainly true.
So it's more, I guess, a question of, is Parliament's been opening up things more and more regarding succession, not necessarily with the person who will become monarch, but you know, if I'm not mistaken, a Protestant could, or the king could marry a Catholic queen, or you know, that sort of thing. I don't think you could marry a Catholic. I don't think you could marry a Catholic and still be in the line of succession. I think that's removed now, as well as yeah, I think that's it. Theo, is that correct?
I believe so. I think it was under Gordon Brown that legislation went through. Dr. Shaw might recall better than I, but yes,
it does ring a bell. It's one of those things that it's you know, it's one of those things that doesn't really make a difference, but it's sort of interesting.
Yes.
Every now and then, one of the members of the royal family, minor members of the royal family, becomes a Catholic. It happened some years ago with Lord Nicholas Windsor. It happened more recently with someone else I hadn't heard of. Do you remember, Theo? A female member of the royal family became, and she was excluded from the line of succession. I mean, not that it made the slightest bit of difference. She was the 30th in line or something. Nevertheless, it's interesting, and it's also, and one of the odd things about it, of course, is that the Act of Succession excludes Catholics. It doesn't exclude Hindus or animists or Buddhists or anything else like that. So it's obviously the threat that they felt was very, very specific. They couldn't imagine anyone, you know, adopting.
But doesn't it say he promises to ensure the Protestant succession?
Well, yeah, but what the Act of Succession itself, which was designed to ensure the Protestant succession, it says it excludes from the line of succession anyone who adopts the Catholic religion. Okay,
so the oath doesn't necessarily exclude anybody else except for Catholics.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, after all, I mean, they brought in, I mean, with the Hanoverians, they brought in people who were not Anglican. I mean, they were kind of adopted Anglicanism, but what's important about them is they weren't Catholic. I mean, I suppose they were Lutheran.
Yeah.
You might think, oh, well, sort of close enough. But
yeah. Well, yeah, so that makes sense. The other thing with the oath is also he promises to restore things that have fallen, you know, which have decayed and maintained, you know, things, as well as, you know, he also promises that to believe in the gospel and all that stuff. is that not a little, in some ways, from a Catholic perspective, not isn't that contradictory to kind of upholding the Protestant faith? If I know he's not meaning it necessarily, but is that not contradictory in some ways?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Okay, but so like if you're promising to believe in the true faith, well, you can't whatever true is the faith that you're professing. If the true faith is not Protestantism, which we believe it isn't, is that not contradictory? If that makes sense. Like, if someone decided that the Protestant faith wasn't the true faith, is that not contradictory?
So if he decides that it's not the true faith, or if someone else decides it's not the true faith, or
well, okay, so like, I mean, we all believe that there's only one true faith, right? So whatever he's swearing to believe, he's trying to believe both the true faith and Protestantism, which are disconnected.
I see. Well,
does that make sense? Or am I just trying to, I don't know, am I...
Well, obviously he thinks that it's the true faith, so that's what he's...
But what if he came around to the Catholic faith? What would it be, the present oath then, therefore?
Well, obviously, if they wanted to make it possible for a Catholic to become king, then they'd have to change the oath. Okay. At least in some ways, that he could protect, like he does, as it was already. He's not a member of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, because you can't be a member of two incompatible ecclesial communities at the same time. So, but he promised not to hold their privileges in Scotland.
Mr. James Bogle's here. Sorry, I just want to bring him in. Hello.
Hello. Sorry, I've had difficulty getting into the program.
Oh, okay.
Evening, Jamie.
Hi.
Let me know when you're...
Jamie seems to be on a roller coaster.
Afraid so. So how's it been going?
Good. So we're at the moment we're going through the coronation liturgy and discussing the different elements. We're last discussing the oath, and I was just saying whether or not, or I was asking if someone believes in, if sort of,
yes.
because the Catholic faith is the truth faith, when someone takes an oath to uphold the true faith and then professes the Protestant faith, are those kind of opposites?
I seem to have lost you.
Can you hear me?
Are you still there?
We can hear you.
We lost him.
Oh dear.
Hopefully he'll.
Shall we press on and perhaps he can?
He's back. Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I lost you there for a minute.
That's all right. So we were discussing the oath and the oath to maintain the Protestant faith, but also in a different part of it, he proclaims the true gospel faith. Is there a sense of contradiction when he does the oath to do both of those things?
Well, I mean, does it really matter that much? In the modern world, when with Christianity the most persecuted religion in the world, and the statistics prove this, you can go and check up with Aid to the Church and Needy Catholic Charity, who have shown that there's no question that Christianity is the most persecuted religion in the world. Are we really going to focus on the fact that the coronation is a Christian service, or are we going to focus on the fact that a small part of it entails the sovereign, unsurprisingly, having to support the state religion of the country, namely the Protestant religion? Is it really that important? I mean, obviously, the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism are important to Catholics and indeed to truth generally. But when we're talking in terms of coronations, we're talking not just about theological debates, we're talking about the wider political scene. And in the context of the wider political scene, quite clearly, the coronation is a very overtly, deliberately, clearly, if not indeed blatantly, Christian ceremony, and a Christian ceremony in which we are crowning a head of state who fulfills a role that gives a flavour to our constitution, our state, and our politics, which is profoundly Christian. Surely that is the most important thing, rather than the small part of the service in which the monarch is obliged by law to swear to protect the Protestant religion. Isn't that the important thing? The fact that it's Christian, not that it's Protestant?
Yes, that's just where we were in the conversation. I appreciate your explanation, and yes, I was just maybe it's just from an American perspective that stood out to me during the coronation.
Well, what stands out to me much more is the fact that America is a far more Protestant or post-Protestant nation than the United Kingdom. For Americans to get all tangled up about the oath to protect the Protestant religion is frankly bordering upon the ridiculous when you consider how very much the American political history and religious history is so profoundly and uncompromisingly Protestant. Isn't there something a little bit strange about Americans, including American Catholics, falling over themselves to be worried and concerned, if not indeed worse, about a very small section of the coronation service which deals with upholding the Protestant religion, when their whole country and its history is profoundly Protestant and now post-Protestant? Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I also have a lot of problems with American history and American government as well. So I'm not really trying to critique it. I'm just want to hear your opinions.
No, I think the most important thing about the coronation service is that it's Christian at all. And despite a lot of talk about there being attempts to turn it into a service which was multi-faith, multicultural, it hasn't actually turned out to be that way. It has been uncompromisingly and clearly and openly and very obviously Christian. And it has always historically been part of the Christian and particularly the Catholic religion and faith, that it extends a certain measure of toleration to other religions, because we profoundly believe that religion is not something you can force on people. And so, in my view, the fact that it remains a profoundly Christian service, but at the same time allows other religions to come and pay a certain homage to Christianity, strikes me as a profoundly good thing. Because in effect, those religions are paying homage to the Christian religion, whether they consciously recognize that or not. I don't know how others feel about it, but that seems to me a profoundly good thing. And indeed, to me, it reflects and harks back to the days of our last Catholic monarch in Britain, namely King James II of England and Ireland, the 7th of Scotland, when he issued his Declaration of Indulgence, which granted liberty of conscience and freedom of religious practice and belief to everybody, even Muslims, Jews, and atheists. Now, of course, they had to respect the laws of the Christian kingdoms, the three Christian kingdoms of the what became later the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, and Ireland. But they in their own personal daily lives were allowed to go about their own religious beliefs as the king had decreed. Now, for that reason, he was later exiled from the throne by those who believed that the Anglican religion in England and Ireland and the Presbyterian religion in Scotland should be imposed, literally, upon the entire population, with very severe penalties for those who refused to conform. So, in point of fact, as has always been the case, the Catholic religion is much more tolerant than most other religions. And I think the coronation service, as it took place, to some extent harks back to that. And that's a profoundly Catholic idea. And I might also add that the form and format of the coronation service is, if anything, more Catholic than it has been for a very long time. So it seems to me to focus on the very small part of the coronation service, in which the king is obliged by law to swear to protect the Protestant religion, is really to focus in a rather unbalanced and biased way. Let's look at the much wider picture, which I think on balance is a very positive one. I don't know if others agree with that.
Dr. Shaw, do you have anything?
Yes, I do. Shall we? We seem to have got into a bit of a rut here, Connor. Shall we move on?
Yes, move on. Sorry. Yes, the King's Prayer is very interesting. He asks God to, I think it was grant him perfect freedom, yes, and the knowledge of the truth of thy faith. And I think that it was really a beautiful element of the coronation, and especially it's really his words. So which shows what he believes and what he wants. It seems like he at least is genuinely searching for truth, which I think is a good element to have in a monarch. Theo, do you have anything? What do you think of that?
Nothing to add, Connor, really, on the King's Prayer there.
Mr. Bogle, do you have anything you'd like to add about that prayer?
Well, yes, I think I agree with you. I think it's a nice addition, indeed a novelty, really, to the coronation, but I think a good one. But coronations are a public manifestation. It isn't really about the private views of individuals. It's about a public statement about the nature of your constitution and the nature of your head of state and the nature of your the framework of your state. And in that respect, I think whatever the private beliefs of the king may be, his prayer and the prayers which go to make up the coronation service are profoundly Christian. Now, we're led to believe, and I think probably rightly so, that the king is indeed a Christian. What sort of a Christian is probably open to debate. But I do know for certain that he, whilst he was Prince of Wales, every year was quite happy to do a broadcast on behalf of persecuted Christians around the world for aid to the Church in Need, knowing and fully appreciating that it is a Catholic charity, talking about places he had visited where Christianity is persecuted, talking about priests and nuns who've been persecuted, religious orders, and asking the rest of the world to recognize that this is wrong and something should be done about it. That, to me, is a sign of a Christian king. I would be interested to know from anybody how often the American president or the Irish president or the French president or the German president or any of the other presidents around the world bother to take the time out to make a broadcast or indeed to speak about the persecution of Christianity worldwide, even though it's the most persecuted religion in the world. And yet our king has done so. That to me is highly significant. And what really matters is the public statements that are made. I think, obviously, private prayers are very important, but when it comes to something like a coronation, it's a public statement. So what they say and what the king says and what the coronation service says publicly is very important. And I think very positive in today's world, today's largely secularist world, to have a king and constitution and coronation service that speaks openly, clearly, and strongly in strong Christian tones is a very positive and good thing. That's my take on that.
Yes. Interesting enough, I don't think many have. I don't think any presidents have really spoken out on Christian persecution. I did, if anybody's interested, I did an episode with Dr. Thomas Williams on his book about Christian persecution all over the world. So it really is it's an under discussed topic. And
well, there's another thing there too, which is interesting. Our late Queen famously every year gave a broadcast at Christmas time, a Christmas broadcast, in which she, pardon me, unhesitatingly declared her own personal Christian faith, gave a Christian testimony, in addition, of course, to all the other things that she did, talking about her family and about things that happened during the year, but always ending on a note about her personal faith, about Jesus Christ, and about the Christian religion. And that is something that you will not find, or at least not that I'm aware of, among most other presidents of republics around the world. Even the Irish president, in a country historically associated with Catholicism, had virtually nothing to say in his last 3 or 4 broadcasts at Christmas time. I think last year the Irish president mentioned Laudato Si of Pope Francis, which is essentially nothing to do with Christianity and all to do with environmentalism. So that's not terribly Christian. I think certainly the French president wouldn't even dare to open his mouth to say anything positive about Christianity. And the German president said absolutely nothing, even though he is personally an evangelical Christian. And I don't know of any other presidents who've said anything positive, but the British monarch persistently does say and witness to her Christian faith, and now the present king has done the same in the coronation service, and I'm quite sure that when it comes to Christmas time, he will also give a testimony that is broadly Christian and openly and unashamedly Christian.
yes.
That is quite an extraordinary thing in the modern age.
I agree. Very extraordinary. The Gloria was done in Latin, which is very interesting.
And indeed, I just looking at the order of service, it actually makes a point of saying that this Gloria was written for the recusant Catholic community under persecution by William Byrd. I think that's. I'm not really in favour of self-flagellation in public events like that, but it is nice to see that acknowledgement. They're not trying to whitewash the place of the Catholic Church. This is the first time they've had a Latin bit of the coronation for some time, and it's by our great recusant composer.
I did not know he was recusant. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
And then Theo mentioned that the epistle was read by the prime minister, which I thought was I think it was slightly amusing, but I thought it was very interesting, at least for a Hindu to read the epistle. But that's just me. Was that surprising or not surprising? Because I guess it was planned. But uh, were you surprised that a Hindu prime minister would insert himself into this part?
Well, he's there ex officio, as the little note there says. But I must say, I do find it a bit odd. I take it he doesn't endorse the worldview of St. Paul, and maybe he thinks this particular passage was kind of unoffensive, but it does seem a little bit odd. The constitutional role of the prime minister vis-a-vis religious matters is something which itself has evolved. Gordon Brown, for example, said he didn't want to nominate Anglican bishops. So Gordon Brown was not an Anglican; he was a Scotch Presbyterian by upbringing, and he gave up the historical role of the prime minister in choosing which of three names presented to him by the church commissioners should go forward to be confirmed by the monarch. They've been doing this for heaven knows how long, and it no longer happens. I'm not sorry, really. I don't think the prime minister's had a particularly kind of wonderful effect on the selection process, and the idea of, well, we've even had a Catholic prime minister since then, in some sense, Boris Johnson. So so I don't know. It just seems you're right. It does seem a bit odd. It does seem a bit odd to me. I wonder what his attitude was.
It did make me laugh out loud during it. I'm afraid to say. I thought this is crazy. Mr. Bogle, do you have any thoughts on that? Did it surprise you?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. Hindus are, it's essentially Hinduism is a very syncretistic religion. That is to say, it tries to knot together beliefs of various religions in the belief that they are not terribly different and are achieving the same goal. So it doesn't surprise me entirely, or indeed really at all, that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was quite happy to read a reading at the coronation service. He could have said, as Prime Minister, if he had a particular objection, no, I don't think I'm the right person to do that, but he didn't, because that's his particular Hindu syncretistic belief. I think it was a good thing that the Prime Minister read, and I thought he did it rather well, from the Bible, because the Bible is Christian. So once again, those who are not Christians are lending their support willy-nilly, whether they intend it strongly or not, to a fundamentally Christian service, for the crowning of a Christian king in a kingdom that is, at the very least, nominally Christian, at the head of a constitution which is Christian, and that's a good thing. Historically, Catholic constitutions did not exclude people who were not of the Catholic religion from being participating in the political process and even occupying offices of state, whether they were Jews or Muslims. Not many Muslims, it has to be said, but that was largely because the Muslims didn't want to participate. Whereas in Protestant countries, the tendency has been to exclude anybody who was not a member of the state religion. For example, in Scandinavia, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, couldn't occupy a high political office unless you were of the state religion. And notoriously, of course, in England and in Scotland, you couldn't occupy not just offices of state, but you couldn't be a lawyer, a doctor, a teacher, all sorts of professions, if you were a Catholic, or indeed a dissenter, a nonconformist, that is to say, a Methodist, a Baptist, and so on. But in Catholic countries, you could be, provided you respected the Catholic constitution and did not try to undermine it in any way. So in a sense, we've now moved on in Britain, where the once actually surprisingly narrow-minded Church of England has now broadened out to adopt a view which would historically have been associated with the Catholic Church. Not entirely, of course, but more so than, say, in 1953, and certainly a lot more so than in 1553, 1653, 1753, and 1853. So, that's, I think, a positive development. And it wasn't as if Rishi Sunak was for 1 minute allowed to interpose into the service anything of his slightly unusual Hindu religion. I mean, I don't know if you're aware, but the Prime Minister has on his desk an image which they would regard as semi-divine of one of the Hindu gods who is half man, half elephant. So for the very first time, we have a heathen Hindu Prime Minister who has such an image on his desk in his prime ministerial office. I'm not sure that's a particularly positive development, but in terms of the coronation, he wasn't allowed in any way, size, shape or form to interpose those unusual religious beliefs into the service. Instead, as Prime Minister, regardless of his Hindu religion, he read a passage from the Bible, thereby showing to the world that the constitution of these kingdoms remains, however attenuated, however weakly, and however nominally, at root Christian. And that, to my mind, is a good thing.
Yes, I agree. In some ways, he's putting to service at a to the Christian religion, paying homage, as you have said, and that is quite surprising, but also I'd say a welcome one. At least it's better than the alternative.
Indeed. And I mean, if you take the United States, what do you have at an inauguration of a United States president? You basically have a secularist service or performance, or whatever you want to call it, inauguration, which has virtually nothing of the Christian religion, except for a small section when some usually very liberal Protestant minister comes and says a couple of prayers. And that's it. The rest of the inauguration has really no Christian substance to it at all, or any religious substance to it. It's essentially secularist.
I do believe
yes, it's true that the president swears his oath upon a Bible.
Yes.
And it's true that you, as I say, have a minister who might say some desultory prayers. But apart from that, what's Christian about it? Now, and this is in a country where a very large number of people are regular churchgoers and church attenders. And yet its constitution is deliberately and consciously secularist. And then on top of that, instead of having beautiful music like Hubert Parry's I Was Glad, or famously Handel's Zadok the Priest, all of which are straight from the Bible, and all the other music and prayers, which are, of course, all straight from the Christian Bible, we have what? We have Lady Gaga singing, Say Can You See by the Dawn's Early Light, or whatever it was that she was singing, My Country 'Tis of Thee, and so on. None of which are Christian hymns in any case. They are revolutionary hymns. And secondly, you've got some tawdry pop star singing it. Now, I don't want to disparage the American presidential inauguration, because it does have a certain dignity and solemnity to it, which a lot of other inaugurations do not have. But let's not kid ourselves that it's a Christian service. It isn't. It's a secular service in which a Christian is allowed to say a couple of small prayers. I mean, that's the truth of it, really, isn't it?
Yeah, well said. Dr. Shaw had to leave. I thank him for his time, and he has a book that recently came out. I'll put that in the description if any, and it's very fitting. I think it's about the culture and about the mass, and how the church, the connections between church and culture and that sort of thing. So I will link that in the description. But yes, you're
Can I
very
just add one other thing? For those Americans, or those of your audience, I assume some are Americans, who have not seen it, may I suggest that you go and watch on YouTube the Irish National Commemoration Day, bearing in mind that Ireland historically prides itself on being a Catholic nation. It quite clearly no longer is. If you go to National Commemoration Day, you will see that it has an array of ministers and representatives from the various Christian denominations and from all the other religions, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and the Irish secular society, humanist society, who are overtly atheist. And they are all treated exactly equal in that national commemoration, which is meant to commemorate the beginning of the Irish Free State in 1922, which was the beginning of Irish independence from Britain. This is a secular celebration, and secularism is a belief system. It is as much a belief system as any religion. So effectively, the new belief system of the Irish state, as in most other republics, is secularism, not Christianity, and certainly not Catholicism. And yet I venture to suggest that there are many Irish people, and certainly people in the United States, who think of Ireland as a Catholic country, but it isn't. It's a secular country with a secular government, a secular constitution, and secular services. And if there's any further doubt about that, one can go and read a judgment of the Irish Supreme Court in 1999, the case of Corway against independent newspapers, in which the judge representing the judgment of the Irish Supreme Court, Mr. Justice Barrington, says, and I quote, "The 1922 Constitution was a totally secular constitution." So what happened in Ireland is that after the rebellion and the revolution and the setting up of the Irish Free State, it went from being a Christian constitution, albeit Protestant, in a Catholic country, once Catholic country, to a completely secular constitution, or as Mr. Justice Barrington put it, totally secular. And if you go and see on YouTube or go and visit in person the National Commemoration Day, you will see that that is what is now the constitution of the Irish state. Is this progress? Well, if you're a secularist, yes. If you're a Christian, and above all a Catholic, it is just anything but progress. It is regress. Whereas in the United Kingdom, albeit it's a Protestant constitution, it's still at least Christian. And that is not something to be gainsaid or treated lightly. It's a very important aspect of our constitution.
Yes, thank you for highlighting that. I'd like to bring us now to discuss the missing peerages in the ceremony. My understanding is in the 50s there were many peers that gave homage to the Queen during the coronation, and the peers have seemingly been left out of that. Theo, do you have anything to would you like to explain that, I guess?
Well, yes, I'd like to hear Mr. Bogle's thoughts on this, because before he joined, I offered the comment that overall the the service, the rite was very edifying and magnificent, and the elements of modern corruption were surprisingly few. But I think that the most regrettable development, in my mind, with constitutional implications, was the widespread absence of the peerage. And as Dr. Shaw said before he left, the peers of the realm represented the community of the realm at large. And there is a puzzle to this coronation, in that we live ostensibly in a parliamentary monarchy, but the presence of members of parliament, both members of the House of Commons and members of the House of Lords, was quite slight. Initially, I believe there were 30 members of each house invited, which was far less than 1953, which caused some rancor among the members. And I think that number was increased, but not by too much. And this is part of the overall character of this coronation as being slimmed down. Now, I think that the absence of the peers is highly regrettable, since, as Roger Scruton put it, the peers represent the long-term interests of territory, as opposed to, or in concert with, the short-term interests of individual voters who elect their constituent MPs. And the power of the House of Lords has been steadily denuded for some time, most significantly in recent memory with the removal of most of the hereditaries by the Blair terror. But nevertheless, that absence, I think, bodes ill, because in 1953, for instance, and every coronation previously, after the monarch was actually crowned, all of the peers of the realm would then place their own coronets, which is a perfect visual representation of the constitutional fact that the peers receive they are vassals. They receive their fief, their domain, from their liege, the sovereign. In Platonic terms, they are like emanations, and so the power of the ducal coronet is derived from the sovereign's crown. Apart from anything else, it made an amazingly aesthetic picture to all those scarlet robes trimmed with ermine and the coronets as well. It was very arresting. So the loss of the peers is troubling, because that whole layer of our constitution is now being eclipsed. And I think that, again, this could be the responsibility. This could be the action of that civil service committee I mentioned. But if the reasoning is that, today we don't want to elevate those of inherited privilege and status, well, what does that say about the monarchy? I mean, the monarch is just the most powerful nobleman. So if the monarch is supporting the estrangement and the eclipse of the nobility, then he's cutting off the branch on which he sits. So I think it's short-sighted, and it's also it's regrettable in that the aristocracy still have quite a lot of power, even in a quite a subtle way. 30% of the land in England is still owned by the aristocracy. I grew up in the chalklands of Wiltshire in the southwest, and most of the farms around where I lived were actually tenant farmers of the local Earl of Radnor, who would have been there, or his father or his ancestor would have been in there in 1953, and he would have been there if the convention had been observed. So these are figures who actually do wield power, and a general political principle is that power should be visible. That's a Catholic principle. That's why we have all of these magnificent ornaments and the regalia and the ceremony, is to dignify and to make visible power and authority. And when power is not visible, that's a very bad thing. That leads to all sorts of subterfuge and manipulation, and lack of accountability and transparency, which is very damaging for a political community. So it's all regrettable. And as I say, the visual spectacle was spectacular, but it would have been even more spectacular if it had been allowed. There was one old aristocrat who was insisting that he be allowed to arrive in his family's horse-drawn coach, and the Lord Mayor of London had a horse-drawn coach, and the Speaker of the House of Commons. So there would have been a magnificent procession of all these coaches, which wasn't permitted. Additionally, if we go back to the question of the constitutional essence of parliamentary monarchy, what does it say if members of Parliament generally, both of Commons and Lords, are not actually present en masse at this central constitutional event? David Stark, this is where I'd like to get Jamie's thoughts, but David Starkey suggested that this is because they're not interested, whereas I would submit it's partly because Parliament is no longer sovereign. That the Constitution, that Parliament is legally sovereign, but not de facto sovereign.
Who's de facto sovereign?
Well, the international oligarchs who are de facto sovereign in the United States and every other country. But this is suggestive of it.
Yes, and it's sort of suggestive that the peers recognize that.
No, the peers wanted to attend, but they were told they couldn't attend.
By whom?
Well, under the authority of the king, but I would imagine that decision was made by this committee. But it doesn't say too well for King Charles that he sanctioned that decision. As I say, it rather undermines his own position if he's going to neglect those of inherited privilege, because who is he? I mean, he's someone who's
yeah, so he's the chief inheritor.
Right. So it's short-sighted. It's short-sighted.
Yes.
And not only the peers, but also the members of the House of Commons, the elected representatives, who of course are the servants of the oligarchs de facto. But nevertheless, the fact that they weren't present, it's sort of troubling.
Yes, it seems that it also takes away from the sort of beauty, as well as you said. I'm not sure if Mr. Bogle will be joining us again, but it's definitely a shame not to have them participating. And from my understanding, if I'm correct, the Duke of Norfolk, who used to run the coronation, or was used to be chairman of the coronation committee, except for I think Prince Philip was maybe the chairman the last time, was not part of the committee this time.
No, he actually was.
He was.
You can see him in the procession. Sadly, not a practicing Catholic, and although he was, obviously his family has a great history of being the leading Catholic laity in the realm. But yes, nevertheless, he did still take up that hereditary position as the chief organizer of the coronation. So he would have, I suppose, signed off on these major decisions to disinvite or to not invite his fellow peers.
It's an oddity.
Yes.
To not invite your peers, especially since he by de facto gets to go because he's the Earl Marshal, or is there another reason?
Yes, it's one of the duties that is tied to that position of Earl Marshal of England.
Okay, so yeah,
which by the way is so called because of its descent from William Marshall.
oh really?
Indeed, yes.
Okay.
His line, what do I want to say? His offspring, his descendants, married into the Howards. They in the female line, and so the Howards of Norfolk inherited the position of Earl Marshal, coming to us from William Marshal, who, as some people say, was the ultimate medieval Chad.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't realize marshal. So is the term marshal in the military sense? Is that all the way back just to a person's last name? Does it not have any original military?
No, it has original. I mean, it comes
Oh, it
from
does.
Martial Latin, Mars, the god of war.
Okay, so it does. Okay, so it's
Yeah,
not
but-
it's not
but-
just
But
random.
the Earl Marshal of England comes from William Marshall.
Okay, and he probably got that name from being from military.
Yes, I suppose so. Yes,
Okay.
servant of 5 kings of England.
Oh wow. Okay.
Knight Templar, savior of the realm, crusader,
Well,
tournament champion.
I think this is the place to wrap up. I'll just say the anointing is interesting because it's done. Oh no, never mind. Hold on. Hello, Mr. Bogle. Welcome back.
Yep, I'm sorry, I lost the signal again. I'm in Lourdes, and the signal comes in and out.
Well, I appreciate you being able to be with us, anyways. Theo was talking about the absence of the peers and its constitutional element. Do you have anything, or would you mind addressing that point of the missing peers and how that affects the politics of the realm?
Yes, well, I think I agree with what Theo Howard was saying. I think the absence of a prominent position of the peers was perhaps the one or the main significant defect in the coronation service. They played a prominent part in the coronation service in 1953. But they didn't seem to play much of a part at all in the coronation of 2023. And I think that's unfortunate for a number of reasons. I mean, I agree with Theo's points, but I also think there are additional points. James I famously said during his reign, in argument against the more extreme Protestants who wanted to do away with bishops. He said, no bishop, no king. In other words, what he was saying was, get rid of the bishops and I'll be next on the chopping block. And of course, that was quite right. That was what the extremist Protestants intended and were halfway to achieving in Scotland, and certainly did achieve in Calvin's Geneva. I think the same can be said of the peers. If you're going to get rid of the peers, particularly the hereditary peers, but peers in general, the House of Peers, you are in fact threatening the monarchy. The idea that you can have a slimmed down monarchy in which you focus almost exclusively on the monarch and nothing else is I think, misguided thinking. The monarchy is at the head of a system and a hierarchy which recognizes the importance of hierarchy. And you might say, well, why does hierarchy matter? Can't we all just be equal? No, the answer is you can't. The reason is because if you try to do that, you will fail, number one. And secondly, egalitarianism, or the ideology that everyone is or should be put on an equal par, is itself self-defeating. Why is that? Well, the answer is this. If nobody is above you, because we're all absolutely equal, then to whom do you apply for redress of your grievances? The answer is nobody, because there's no one above you. There's no employer, there's no judge, there's no state officials, there's no monarch. Literally, nobody is above you if you have absolute egalitarianism. So how are you going to resolve grievances? You've got nobody to apply to. You can't have a trial because a judge would be above you. And the simple answer is that he who has the greatest numbers will win. And this is simply might is right. It is the victory of force and might over everything else. But that is the very definition of chaos, anarchy, oppression, and dictatorship. And that is why hierarchy is important and why egalitarianism is fundamentally damaging to society. Indeed, it's probably the ultimate destruction of society. The classic example of that, of course, is communism. Communism was meant to be a system where everybody was equal. It was ultimate egalitarianism. And we have seen how dismally it failed. On a more comic, but nonetheless instructive note, if you have ever seen Gilbert and Sullivan's The Gondoliers, you will see that it concludes after an attempt by the Gondoliers to create an egalitarian society and do away with the monarchy and the nobility, which fails. They end up singing, "When everybody's somebody, no one's anybody." And that is, of course, the truth of it. When everybody's somebody, no one's anybody. And that's putting it in a rather comic way, but nonetheless, it contains a profound truth about egalitarianism. Egalitarianism, which is, of course, the creed that is being pushed by secularists the world over, particularly Republican secularists, is in fact a recipe for disaster. It simply means might is right. Whereas if you have a hierarchy, you have somebody above you to whom you can focus your loyalty, to whom you can apply for redress of grievance, to whom you have a degree of two-way loyalty and honor, all of which builds up society and doesn't destroy it. Now, I think if you're going to minimize the peers, and let's face it, that was done on the basis of some spurious egalitarianism, you are endangering the monarchy and society as a whole, because you are taking away a very important intermediate stage between monarch and people, and you are taking away a very important prop to your monarchical constitution. Now, as I understand it, peers did attend the coronation. They were permitted to wear their robes. However many of them did so, we don't know, because they're virtually invisible in the, at least in the broadcast of the coronation. And in 1953, they all stood around the crown, the monarch, and when she was crowned, immediately after she was crowned, they, in their robes of state, put on their individual coronets to symbolize the hierarchy in society, which is necessary to keep society in one piece and to ensure justice and fairness to all. Now, that is a profoundly unpopular view in 2023 around the world, but it is profoundly true. And the more we try to do away with hierarchy, which includes not just the peers and the monarch, but also things like employers and judges and people who are above us, teachers, parents, the more we are actually undermining society. And I think that aspect of minimizing the peerage is the one that I think was most unfortunate and something of a blemish on an otherwise very admirable coronation service.
Very well said. It reminds me of I think C.S. Lewis quoted, or was it has a quote in which he says, if something to this effect, I'm not going to, I don't have it memorized, but just that once people stop honoring monarch, once they no longer have a monarch, they will begin to honor actors, actresses, and singers and that sort of thing. Humans need something, and if they do not have that something to honor in the physical, they will then go to a lesser and more probably profane area to offer their honoring.
I think you're right. And also ask yourself, why do they honour actors and actresses? After all, in times past when actors and actresses were not that important, they didn't really honour them much. The reason they honour them now is because they're rich, famous celebrities. It's exactly proving the point I was making, that with egalitarianism, you don't get equality in the sense of justice. What you get is might is right. In other words, the rich, the famous, and the celebrities matter. Nobody else matters. That is what happens when you do away with natural hierarchy.
Yes, I agree completely. It's a little more difficult in places without a peerage, unfortunately, and England is and Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales are lucky to have a peerage. It's disappointing that they're sort of are pushed aside in place of egalitarianism. I think that's where we should wrap up. Theo, do you have any final things to say?
Well, I think there's plenty there still to discuss. So perhaps another time.
Sure.
But some of the parts there that I think we've skipped over, such as the presentation of the swords, were very edifying, particularly with the Greek Orthodox chant in the background. I thought that was quite moving, and for all those elements and things like the presentation of the gospel belonging to St. Augustine of Canterbury, I didn't even know such a treasure existed. But living reminders there of England's true Catholic past, of Merry England, are deeply stirring.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. I will. I'll link in the description to this PDF for people if they are interested in going over themselves. I wish we could go over everything, but we'd be here all day otherwise. So maybe another time we could talk more. Mr. Bogle, do you have anything you'd like to say as we wrap up?
No, I would just like to say I very much agree with what Theo is saying. The symbolism of the coronation is superbly and supremely Christian. The reason, of course, is because it is an almost exact replica of the coronation service of the Holy Roman Emperors, the Catholic Holy Roman Emperors, right the way back to Charlemagne, as it developed over those centuries. And all the other kings and princes of Christendom emulated that coronation service. But sadly, the only one left emulating it, and it does so with an extraordinary exactitude, is Britain. So we have a treasure in the coronation which is fundamentally Catholic because it's borrowed directly from the Catholic service, coronation service of the Holy Roman Emperors, stretching back 1,000 years. 1,000 years being the most important 1,000 years of Christianity. And of course, before that, it also has echoes of the coronation of the Eastern emperors in what has since been called Byzantium. And therefore, it's in the interest, in my view, of Catholics as much as anybody that this coronation service is preserved, because it represents that profoundly Christian Catholic past that is associated with Catholic kingdoms down the centuries. And so, for example, the the swords, the spurs, the ampulla, the oil of anointing, the anointing on the head, chest, and feet, the fact that it's during a communion service, what we would call the Mass, the fact that it is surrounded by sacred music and sacred prayers, the fact that the king himself is wearing what are effectively sacerdotal robes. He doesn't wear a chasuble because that is strictly for a priest, but he does wear a royal alb, tunicle, cope, buskins, the glove, the ring, the scepter. Well, those are all clericalist or clerical or sacerdotal garments. But in addition to that, of course, he has the purely royal elements like the scepter, the orb to symbolize the kingship of Christ over the earth, the crown, and so on. But they are also resonant of the symbols of the Passion. Why do kings wear crowns? Because they are reflective of the crown of thorns. The scepter is reflective of the reed that was put in the hand of Christ. The cope is reflective of the purple cloak, which was a symbol in those days of Roman imperialism, which was mockingly placed on the shoulders of Christ. These are all reflected in the symbolism of Christian monarchy, precisely because being a Christian monarch, or indeed a Christian leader of any sort, involves and entails a way of the cross, a suffering and sacrifice that you have to undergo if you are going to be a leader. Hence, the old expression, uneasy lies the head upon which sits the crown, because it's a difficult role to fulfill. And we've only got to see what has happened down the centuries to Christian kings. They've not only been persecuted, but they've been murdered, as in the case of Tsar Nicholas II, or Louis XVI, or our own King Charles I. And many princes and kings throughout the 19th century were gunned down, murdered by revolutionaries. This is an exact reflection or resonance of the sacrifice and the sacrificial death of Christ. So all of these symbols are hugely significant and relevant to understanding the Christian nature and the Christ-like nature, to some extent, of the Christian monarch and the Christian monarchy, regardless of the worthiness or unworthiness of the occupant of the throne. The symbols are nonetheless vitally important, in exactly the same way that we don't regard the personal worthiness of a priest in administering the sacraments. We regard the fact of his being a priest and able to administer the sacraments as the important thing, so that God works through our human weakness, and that includes not only through the priesthood, but also in the lay vocation through Christian monarchy, Christian leadership, personified above all by Christian monarchy. So you can criticize King Charles III, you can criticize Queen Camilla for their own personal defects, but as somebody, I think it was Chesterton, said, one of the great things about monarchy is that an ordinary person can be chosen by God to be king. You don't have to be a great academic or a scientist. You can just be a person whom God has chosen.
Indeed. Thank you.